April 1945, a muddy supply depot outside Frankfurt, Germany. The spring rain was cold, turning the ground into thick grey soup. A convoy of heavy battle-scarred trucks rolled into the camp, engines roaring and tires splashing through the mud. Out of the lead vehicle stepped Corporal Thomas Carter. He was 38 years old, a black soldier from Savannah, Georgia. His uniform was soaked, his hands were calloused, and his face was lined with deep, heavy exhaustion. For months, Carter and his unit had been driving supply trucks through the worst of the European winter, hauling tons of ammunition and fuel directly to the front lines. As Carter walked toward the command tent to deliver the cargo manifests, a group of young white officers stood nearby under a dry canvas awning. They wore clean uniforms, dry wool coats, and highly polished leather boots. Carter had to walk right past them. He didn't expect a conversation, but he did expect the basic rules of the United States Army. As he neared the awning, Carter stopped, straightened his back, and raised his hand in a sharp, respectful military salute to a young lieutenant standing at the front of the group. The lieutenant looked directly at Carter. His expression didn't change. He didn't raise his hand. He didn't acknowledge the salute. Instead, the lieutenant slowly turned his back, muttering a quiet remark to the officer next to him. Carter's hand dropped slowly to his side. He kept his head up, his face like stone, and continued walking. He was used to the silence. He was used to the disrespect. But this time, someone else was watching. From the shadow of a nearby command vehicle, General George S. Patton stepped out into the cold rain. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to the channel. We tell the World War II stories that show what happened when pride met reality. These are the forgotten moments where the rigid rules of war collided with the harsh realities of human nature. The arrogant young officer was Lieutenant Arthur Sterling, 24 years old. He came from a family of immense wealth in Boston. Sterling had arrived in Europe only 3 weeks prior, assigned to a rear area administrative post. He had never seen combat. He had never heard the screech of incoming artillery. But he firmly believed that his rank, his West Point education, and his social standing made him superior to the men who kept the Army's engines running. Corporal Thomas Carter had enlisted in 1942. He didn't have a wealthy family. He was part of the Red Ball Express, the legendary, predominantly black truck convoys that kept the Allied advance alive when supply lines were stretched to the breaking point. Now Patton was walking directly toward the awning. His 4 silver stars flashed in the dim afternoon light. His signature ivory-handled revolvers were buckled tight to his waist. The moment the young officers saw the legendary commander approaching, they went rigid. They snapped to attention, their hands instantly flying to their helmets. In crisp, perfect salutes, Patton did not return the salute. He did not even look at the officers gathered under the awning. His heavy boots splashed through the freezing mud as he marched straight past Lieutenant Sterling, splattering wet slush onto the lieutenant's polished leather boots. Patton kept his eyes locked forward, walking directly to the rear of the muddy GMC truck where Corporal Thomas Carter stood. "Corporal," Patton barked. Carter turned quickly, his boots slipping on the wet gravel. He saw the 4 stars on Patton's helmet and began to raise his hand to salute. But before Carter's hand could even reach his helmet, Patton snapped his own hand to the brim of his cap. The 4-star general, the commander of the 3rd Army, saluted the black corporal first. Carter stood frozen in absolute shock, his mouth slightly open, his eyes wide as he looked at the legendary general saluting him in the pouring rain. Slowly, with trembling fingers, Carter returned the salute. Lieutenant Arthur Sterling stepped out from under the dry awning, his face turning pale with confusion and disbelief. He took a hesitant step forward, his voice cracking in the cold air. "General Patton, sir," Sterling stammered with respect. "He is just a corporal." Patton slowly turned his head. His gaze locked onto Sterling like an artillery target. He walked back toward the awning, his heavy boots throwing up mud stopping just inches from Sterling's face. "Just a corporal," Patton whispered. The silence in the yard was absolute. "Let me tell you about this corporal, Lieutenant." Sterling swallowed hard, his posture shaking. "This man has been driving through the frozen hell of this war for 3 years," Patton said, his voice rising, carrying across the entire depot. "He drove cargo trucks in North Africa. He hauled artillery shells through the treacherous mountain passes of Italy when the roads were collapsing into cliffs. And when the invasion of France began, he became part of the Red Ball Express, keeping my armor moving when we ran out of fuel." Patton stepped closer, his chest pressing against Sterling's, forcing the young officer to tilt his head back in fear. "He has fought for this flag longer than you have worn a uniform. He has faced more German steel than you have seen in training manuals. You think your gold bars make you a leader. You think your bloodline makes you a gentleman." Patton pointed his riding crop directly at the muddy, steam-hissing supply trucks. "Without this corporal and his drivers, my tanks stop, my soldiers starve. We lose this war. You think you are too good to salute him because of his rank? You salute the rank, Lieutenant, but I salute the man." Before the young lieutenant could offer a response, the heavy wooden door to the adjacent command post swung open. Colonel Charles Vance stepped out onto the porch. Vance was 45 years old, a career officer from Alabama and the commander of the supply depot. Steeped in the traditional segregationist customs of the era, Vance had watched the entire confrontation from his window. Fearing that his young lieutenant was about to be destroyed, and hoping to protect the social order he had lived by his entire life, Vance decided to intervene. He adjusted his tunic and walked down the steps, saluting Patton. "General Patton, sir," Vance said, his voice steady but tense. With respect, the lieutenant was simply maintaining the customary order of our home districts. It keeps the peace in the rear areas. We have found that maintaining these boundaries prevents unnecessary friction among the men. Patton slowly turned his gaze toward the colonel. The rain beat down on Patton's helmet, but his posture remained completely motionless. "Colonel Vance," Patton said, his voice dropping to a dangerous icy whisper, "are you telling me that a custom of prejudice is more important than the regulations of the United States Army?" "No, sir," Vance replied, clearing his throat nervously. "But the division of labor and the established social customs keep the depot running smoothly. Surely you understand the necessity of keeping the peace." Patton took a slow, deliberate step toward the colonel, pointing his riding crop directly at the eagle insignia on Vance's shoulder. "The only division I care about in this army is the division of forces that kills Germans." Patton roared, his voice finally breaking into a thunderous, terrifying boom that echoed off the wooden barracks. "And the only order I care about is the one that gets my armor to the Rhine. You think you can use your southern customs to excuse a failure of discipline in my command?" Vance's face went red, but he remained silent. "A failure of discipline is a failure of command, Colonel," Patton continued, his voice shaking with pure, unfiltered rage. "Every man who wears this uniform and risks his life to deliver ammunition to the front line is an American soldier. In the Third Army, there is only one color that matters: olive drab. The uniform is the only skin that matters. If you cannot understand that, you have no business commanding a squad, let alone a depot." Patton stepped even closer to Vance, his jaw clenched. "I will not tolerate any crack in the chain of command, and I will not tolerate snobbery from officers who hide in the rear, while better men bleed in the mud. If I hear of one more salute being withheld in this camp, I will relieve you of command before nightfall. Do we understand each other, Colonel?" Vance stood at strict attention, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his arrogance completely shattered. "Yes, General," Vance whispered. Patton turned his gaze back to Lieutenant Arthur Sterling. The young lieutenant was shivering, his hands trembling at his sides, his eyes wide with terror as the cold rain ran down his face. "Lieutenant Sterling," Patton ordered coldly, "you will walk out into this mud. You will stand before Corporal Carter. and you will salute him properly and apologize for your conduct in front of every witness in this yard." Sterling's hands shook. His polished leather boots, which had not seen a single speck of dirt until this moment, sank deep into the black, freezing mud of the depot. The wet slush covered his ankles, ruining his expensive footwear. He walked slowly, under the watchful eyes of over 200 gathered soldiers, truck drivers, mechanics, and guards, both black and white, who had stopped what they were doing to watch. Sterling stopped 2 feet in front of Corporal Carter. He brought his muddy boots together, raised his hand to the brim of his helmet, and delivered a perfect, trembling salute. "I apologize for my disrespect, Corporal Carter," Sterling said, his voice cracking in the freezing air. "It was a failure of discipline and a violation of regulations." Carter stood straight, his face remaining calm and dignified. He looked at the young officer, returned the salute with a single, precise motion, and spoke in a clear, steady voice. "Accepted, sir." Patton nodded once, satisfying himself that the lesson had been learned. He turned to the gathered men, his voice carrying across the entire yard. "Let this be a warning to every officer under my command. Discipline is a singular thing. It either exists or it does not. And if you forget that, I will remind you personally. Dismissed." Patton turned, climbed back into his command vehicle, and drove out of the depot into the grey rain. But the story didn't end in that muddy German depot. Corporal Thomas Carter survived the war. He returned home to Savannah, Georgia, in late 1945. He left behind the mud of Europe, but he returned to a segregated South that still refused to recognize his service. Despite the challenges, Carter lived a quiet, dignified life, raising his children and working as a long-haul truck driver, pulling heavy cargo across the open highways of a changing America. He rarely spoke about his 3 years in the war, and he never bragged about the day the famous general saluted him first. But in his hallway, he kept a small, framed, black and white photograph, a picture of his truck unit in Germany, taken just days after the war ended. Carter passed away quietly in 1983. At his funeral, 3 elderly truck drivers, 2 white, 1 black, walked up to his casket. They stood at attention, raised their hands, and saluted him one last time. One of them whispered, "Tommy kept us moving when the world stood still. We're here to return the favor." Lieutenant Arthur Sterling was transferred to a frontline infantry platoon the very next morning, exactly as Patton had promised. He survived the war, but the experience changed him forever. The arrogance he had carried into Europe was left behind in the frozen mud of the Saar. He returned to Boston as a quiet, humbled man, spending the rest of his days working in a modest office, never mentioning his service to his family. He passed away in 1974, a man who spent his life carrying the memory of the lesson he had learned in the mud. Colonel Charles Vance was quietly reassigned to a training camp in the United States 3 weeks after the incident. His career stagnated, and he retired in 1950, never receiving his general's star because of Patton's official black mark on his record, General George S. Patton never recorded the incident in his official daily logs, nor did he mention it in his personal memoirs. For him, it was a simple matter of maintaining the machine of war. He knew that a soldier who refuses to salute is a soldier who has already surrendered to his own pride. He understood that the uniform is the only skin that matters in the business of war, and the only salute that counts is the one you earn. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have demanded a public apology, or would you have handled the discipline in private? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more stories about the moments when prejudice met consequences, make sure to subscribe, because history isn't just about dates and battles. It's about the choices men made when the pressure was on, and the men who delivered when it mattered most.